Hi, everyone. We're going to give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Pattison, CHESSA's Director of Member Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to our first CHESSA and CvilleREA joint webinar of 2025 on Citing Smarter Solar Data Insights and Trends in Virginia. We're excited to have this webinar co-hosted by CvilleREA and want to give a special welcome to all of their members who have joined in today, as well as their leadership team for making this happen. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with CHESSA and CvilleREA members who weren't able to join us today live. As a reminder, CHESSA meetings and webinars must be conducted in accordance with antitrust laws. CHESSA is a trade association of competitors, thus compliance with the antitrust laws is essential. It is extremely important that you avoid any communications with other member companies that might be construed to involve any competitively sensitive matters. If any such topic is raised, we will stop the conversation and, if necessary, end the webinar. A quick reminder, we encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible during the Q&A portion of today's event. With that, I'd like to welcome today's key speaker, Elizabeth Marshall, Senior Program Manager of the Virginia Solar Initiative at the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service at the University of Virginia. I also want to briefly turn it over to CHESSA's Executive Director, Robin Dutta, who's going to get us kicked off.
Thanks so much, Jenny, and appreciate everyone who's able to join. I just wanted to provide some very brief remarks. Obviously, we're dealing with, as a solar industry in the last week, the impacts of H.R. 1, which set the timeline for the phase-out of the investment tax credit, as well as more recent executive actions and the implementation of that bill that we'll be seeing in the weeks and months to follow. That's obviously a very bad piece of legislation for our industry. At the same time, there's so much that we can be doing at the state level. There's so much that we can be doing as an industry. We've grown so much. We've become so much stronger in the last 20 years from the nascent alternate energy industry that we used to be. And that means that we've got a fighting chance. That means that there's so much that we can be doing. And the basis for how we advocate for our industry, how we go forward and talk to policymakers about the importance of solar and battery storage is rooted in the facts, and it's rooted in the work that places like the Weldon Cooper Center do. It's part of what makes Elizabeth's work and what everything that she does so incredibly important. So we obviously scheduled this webinar a few months ago, not knowing that we were going to be hit with all this in the last week. But given all of that, I actually think it makes this webinar and this topic and hearing from Elizabeth even more important. If anyone ever wants to talk more about what is CHESSA doing, what the industry can be doing, we're more than happy to have that conversation. But it's also going to be talking about things like Elizabeth is going to be talking about now. So I just wanted to share those thoughts on the outset and turn things over to Elizabeth for what I know will be a very valuable conversation. Elizabeth?
Great. Thank you so much, Robin. And thank you to CHESSA and thank you to CvilleREA for co-hosting this invite and for the invitation to present on the solar database. We are on the cusp of releasing some new Q2 data, so this is a really timely opportunity for us to present to you all. Let's see if I can pull this. So a little bit about us and our work before we dive in. My program, the Virginia Solar Initiative, is housed within the Energy Transition Initiative at the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service at UVA. Our work is really rooted in providing nonpartisan, reliable services to help policymakers make informed, research-driven, and data-driven policy decisions. We do energy forecasting. We build models to, model ratepayer impacts. We do policy analysis. We do research and white papers specifically around topics related to solar, energy storage, and the energy transition. We deliver technical assistance to localities, whether that be helping localities access or know about funding opportunities, best practices. We worked as SolSmart advisors for the state of Virginia, and I'm on the National Technical Advisory Committee for SolSmart. We create computational tools to help localities evaluate possible revenue opportunities that might come as a result of siting renewables in their community. One of these is the Sol Tax tool, which allows developers, localities, and the public alike to come together to look at and examine what the possible impacts of doing an M&T versus a revenue share tax model might be. We created the Virginia Solar Permit, which is an online interactive process map, basically, that helps somebody walk through and understand what the permitting process for a particular solar project might be. All of these decision points or milestones are hyperlinked to the state code or the policy manual or the agency that owns that process. This was a joint project done between Virginia Tech and UVA, and all the process owners participated and reviewed the work. We also have correlating maps for the SCC interconnection process and the PJM interconnection process. The PJM process is asterisk because we need to update it to reflect the expedited process for that. So we do a lot of different things related to providing research and tools to help everybody, the public, decision makers, and stakeholders navigate and understand how these processes work. And so today I'm happy to present on the solar database. The solar database, I'll give you a little background how this project came to be. So in 2021, we worked with the Virginia Department of Energy to launch the Virginia Solar Survey. This was a survey we administered to every county and town across the state, asking them to report out on their experience and questions related to processing solar applications or solar policy. And what came back was, localities were self-reporting how many projects that they had processed. And some of the self-reported data that we were given didn't match some of the documented evidence that we had about how many projects localities had. And so we had got some conflicting data, and it really reinforced to us the need to do a better job of tracking and understanding where solar activity or renewable siting policy discussions and decisions were being made. At the time, and it's still the case, local permitting data exists within the locality that takes action on that application. And there's really no great way to get statewide comprehensive data other than through the Virginia Solar Database. We thought it's really difficult to take local data and match it up with the corresponding permit at the state level or PJM information or EIA information, because so often ownerships change, the name of the project changes, the specific megawatts change, the boundaries of the project might change between the time, it's first proposed and it becomes operational. So we really wanted to figure out, is there a way that we could create some mechanism to track a specific project and see it through its life cycle of permitting? All these various sources of data and mechanisms resulted in conflicting data being presented, both in terms of what the localities were reporting and what we were seeing, but also when state siting policy was proposed and was being debated, there was no central source for this data. It was really up to the person who was presenting or the person advocating for specific policy to provide that data. And so there was often a lack of trust in the data that was being presented, and we wanted to overcome that hurdle. We know from recent studies, such as the JLARC study, that there's going to be a record-breaking energy demand facing our state. And we currently have an all-of-the-above energy policy here in Virginia. So we think those are indications that demand for renewable energy generation siting, solar storage will continue. And so we think we should continue to monitor and track policy activity. One last point, because I do work for the University of Virginia, we are a research university. I noticed a lot of my colleagues, both at UVA and other universities, who were conducting research on land use policy, siting, solar, they were having to recreate this data every time they did a study, which is really inefficient. And so providing that central source of data to support academic research was another a need that we identified. So we had this vision, let's come up with an accurate, comprehensive source of this statewide data for large-scale solar, to do all the things I mentioned, to support data-informed policymaking, to enable monitoring of progress towards Virginia's adopted goals and policies, to facilitate tracking projects across the life cycle of permitting, and to provide foundational data that would support really complex analysis on land use planning and siting across the state. We put together a project plan that started in the spring of 2023, which included a lot of stakeholder engagement. Then we formally launched the tool in November 2024, and now we're providing quarterly updates to the data and putting our eyes towards how we could expand to include additional technologies. Particularly, we're interested in adding storage, standalone storage, and all of this, of course, requires funding. So it's a little uncertain, but this is what our goal is. When we decided that we wanted to pursue this project, we recognized we really needed stakeholder input. One of the challenges with collecting data from all different localities is that localities defined their data points their own way. And so it wasn't always comparing apples to apples. If you pulled acreage of one project from one locality and the acreage of another project from another locality, those two localities might have defined project acreage completely differently. So we wanted to work with a group of really diverse stakeholders to, one, rank and identify the importance of all the possible data points that we could pursue. But more importantly, we wanted them to provide input on how we should be defining these definitions, because we recognized as we collected this data, we would have to do some interpretation and some, standardizing of how we were recording the information so that it became useful, and so that we would be able to then, aggregate data in a way that we could communicate it with some meaning. We had our stakeholders provide to us and suggest to us reliable sources of the data, things that were above and beyond just the primary source locality archives. Also looking to things like utility reports and things of that nature. We had our stakeholders weigh in and prioritize what user experience and database tools and features they wanted the website to have. And then once we built the website, they reviewed the beta version and provided us feedback to ensure that the information and the way it was being presented was going to be relevant and useful to the majority of the people that would be using it. Another thing that came out of this work with stakeholders was a definition for inclusion. So what projects would we include in this? Because, there's distributed generation and utility scale. And we landed on a project over 1 megawatt would be the definition of large scale for our project. And that it had to be advertised for at least one public hearing. A lot of times we were seeing in the minutes in the archives, a developer would go to a public hearing and kind of introduce the project or give a heads up to the public that they were pursuing the project, but then it never turned into a formal application and there was never a public hearing scheduled for it. And so we had a whole list of these projects that we didn't know how, what would happen. Should we include them? Should we not include them? And we had to make that decision. So advertise for at least one local public hearing is what we define as a valid project. And then we excluded government installations such as schools and projects that were done for procurement purposes. It was just too hard to capture all of those and then to categorize whether they were, megawatts that were specifically being used just for that government install or whether they were going to be used for towards the public benefit. So we did make some exceptions. So we have some federal installs in there. And then we thought it would be really beneficial to include projects that were installed on landfills or brownfield projects, given some of the state policy and incentives that were at the time being pursued for brownfield and previously developed lands. So we did want to capture those. So those are in there. We have over 35 data points that we've publicly published. This is a list of all of them. In our data dictionary, we have all these listed with their definitions, their sources. We have another 25 data points that we have working on that we have not published, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later. In terms of our methodology, we mentioned a lot of our strategic partners offered their tracking sheets to us, so their project lists. So some developers, some interest groups, state agencies gave us their records. And so we reconciled all these lists of projects, and we came up with, at the time, it was like a list of like 250 projects, which we thought that was a lot. We had no idea that by the time we launched the project, we would have like evaluated over 1,000 possible projects to be included in this. But we take data from PJM, EIA, DEQ, SCC, Dominion, and Appalachian Power. We go through locality archives, media sources, we call other reliable sources, such as project websites that's sponsored by the developer, utility sites, and even interest groups websites, just to validate and find projects. When we couldn't find evidence of projects, we did reach out to localities and state agencies. We did have to submit a FOIA request at one point to get information. So we really scoured, the ends of the internet, the ends of the universe, to find the data that we use to populate the database. Today, we have over 530 validated projects in the public database. And we maintain this data by a web scraping tool that our amazing data scientist, Emily Leanne, created, which it scours public meeting agendas and hearing notices for anything related to solar. So solar-related actions, zoning actions, policy changes, and reports to us via an automated report that comes with alerts and links. So we're able to take the report, import it into Excel, and we use that to track any new projects or updates to existing projects that we have. And it's pretty powerful and pretty amazing tool that we have. Really helps us stay on top of things. Okay, so now I'm going to transition into giving a tour of the database. So I'm not going to go directly onto the website itself and run through it, because I feel like that's a technological risk for me, but I'll speak to what the features are, and I do have a little embedded video I can show. So right now, the features of the dashboard, we have our landing page, and our landing page contains a little information about the site and our dashboard. And the dashboard has an interactive map and visualizations. We have a downloadable data set. It's the complete data set that we have for all projects with all the data points included. And it's free and open to the public to download. One of the features I think that's great about this data set is that we assign a unique data ID to every project. And that data ID allows us then to link that project to any imported data that we have from state PJM or interconnection operational EIA data. And that allows us to then create that full life cycle look at where projects are in their permitting process. We have an interactive project map that includes filters for all the projects. So you can filter based on project status, whether it was approved or denied, what locality it's in, and what size the project is. And then within that map, you can select a project and it'll pull up what we call them project information sheets or a project card, which is a summary of all the data for that particular project. And then, of course, our data dictionary, which we developed with stakeholder input, that defines how we define each of these data points, which I think is critical, because so many times the data is defined differently just based on the source. And so this is our landing page. I'm hoping this works. Push play. If you scroll down, you'll find there's our dashboard with our interactive map. There's different settings. This one right now is local permit status. All the colors mean something different. You can hover over them and learn information about the projects. You can choose different tabs. You want to look at the project size. You can turn those dots on and off via the legend at the top of that map. We have heat maps that show current data on approved megawatts based on county. And there's a slider that allows a timeline slider for you to explore how those megawattage approvals or denials have changed over time. So we'll switch over, and this is the denied megawatts map. We also have project approval rate. So this will show you the rate of approval across the state as well as the denial rate, and the time sliders work for those as well. If you keep scrolling down, you'll see some pre-selected visualizations of some data. So looking at local permit status summaries based on megawatts or projects. We look at approval rates. And any of these that have a legend, you can turn on and off features based on that legend. So if you don't want to see what was approved or denied, you can click on the blue approval button above it, and it'll turn off the approval. So you can only look at everything else that's left, which I think is really interesting. You can kind of customize the map view that you prefer. On our data page, this is where you'll find the download button to download all of the data set to CSV. This is often missed, so I circled it and highlighted it here, but this is where you'll find it. It's a little blue dot at the top left of the data page. And then below that is the project map, where you can explore filters turning on and off to see what projects meet your desired criteria. The project summary, this is just a visualization of the project summary card. It shows where the project is in the state, and then it breaks out the data into different categories and lists them. And then I think take a breath here, take a pause, and then we'll jump into going over some of the new data that we're releasing. We haven't released it yet. It's current as of June 18th of this year, and I believe the update is scheduled for the website for Wednesday, tomorrow. So first thing I want to share is this is a graph that shows the total amount of megawatts that have been applied for and had action taken on them across the whole state. And so you'll see cumulatively across the whole state, 14,407 megawatts have been approved. Roughly, around 4,000 have been denied, around 2,000 withdrawn, another 2,000 still pending. And then we have this approved amended category. This just means these are projects that were originally approved, but later had to be amended to the extent that they had to submit a new application. And since we didn't want to double count megawattages that were approved, if it was the same project, we pulled out those former projects and called them approved, but later amended. And so that's what that means here. We can break down those approval megawattage, we can break down the megawattage based on the size of the project and look to see whether, what percentage of that approval is represented by that size category. So here, this is a representative of all the megawatts. You can see that projects between 20 megawatts and 150 megawatts that have been approved, that blue bar, represent 38% of all the megawatts that have been processed. One thing I think is always interesting is these smaller projects, the less than or equal to 5 megawatts. The ones that are that size that have been approved represent just 3% of the total megawatts that have been processed. But as we go forward and I show you additional maps, you'll see what a large percentage of projects those 5 megawatts projects represent. So we can also divvy this data up regionally and look at the total megawatts broken out by region. So here you can see clearly Southern Virginia has the most megawatts that's been processed and the most approved, the most denied, and the most pending, while Southwest Virginia has the least amount of megawatts represented. We can look at what the project sizes are within each region. And this is representative of all the projects that have been proposed. It's not just approved. It's all the projects that have been proposed. So in Southern Virginia, they've had, 16 projects proposed that were less than 5 megawatts, which is, again, far and above any other region. I'll talk a little bit more about correlation later, but generally speaking, we found that projects in Southern Virginia tend to be larger and bigger than projects, say, in Hampton Roads. on average, which isn't surprising, I think, given the characteristics of that region, those regions. We're curious to see how do these megawatts, how's this total megawatts, how's the distribution of approvals look like over the years. And so here, this map is showing how many megawatts were approved each year. 2022, as of right now, represents the most megawatts approved, while 2024 represents the most megawatts denied. I think it's interesting here to show that 2025, so we're halfway through 2025, give or take, right? And here, we've only got about a third of the megawattage of the previous years processed. So if we look at this another way, though, and we look at project counts, we're seeing that the number of projects proposed in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024 were roughly the same every year. It's a little variation, but generally speaking, roughly the same. And when we look at the project count for 2025, we are at about half of that project count. So we wanted to take a little closer look at how 2025 was comparing to the most recent year, 2024, and found that, in 2024, we had 74 projects totaling about 3,000 megawatts. Halfway through 2025, we've got 32 projects, but that's only representing about 1,000 megawatts. So half as many projects, but a third of the amount of megawatts. And so we are seeing the average size of projects declining, getting smaller. This could be because of several factors. It could be because of the shared solar programs opening up, especially the one opening in Appalachian Power, but it could also, be an indication that some of those sites that are more suitable for the larger projects have already been processed, proposed, developed, and it's just getting harder to find those large areas that are suitable for large projects. Interestingly, I thought this was really interesting. Number of approved projects in 2024 was 37 for 1,000 megawatts. Already in 2025, we've had 21 approved for about 725 megawatts. So more than half the megawattage that was approved last year, and on trend to maybe do more than the number of approved projects from last year. And conversely, the denials were 26 last year. We're only at 8 this year. And the megawattage was about 1,400 last year, and we're at 300 denied this year. So what we're seeing, and of course it's always early to tell, but it's fun to look at these numbers and say, well, 2025 is trending to slightly less number of actions, less total megawatts proposed, and smaller average project sizes. But it's trending towards more numbers of approvals and more megawatts approved, while we're getting less denials and less megawatts denied. And so to look at this in visual or graph form, we look at these annual local action rate graphs, which I think it's always a big hit. Everyone loves this graph. It really summarizes, I think, well, like the state of what's happening in a really succinct way. But we can see that approval rate was declining for several years. And, for 2 straight quarters now in 2025, that approval rate has been increasing while the denial rate was decreasing. So quite interesting. We can look at of the projects that were approved each year, how do they break down in terms of the size of the project? We see most of the projects that are approved every year tend to be those projects that are less than 5 megawatts, less than or equal to 5 megawatts. And we have, a good portion of projects are still fitting into that 20 to 150 category, and we're still seeing a few 150 and aboves every year. When we look at the denied projects by size range, we can also see that the largest portion of these projects that are denied each year tend to be these really small projects, just because there are so many of them, I'm assuming. But I thought it would be interesting to look at, before I get there, so annual approved megawatts by project size. This is just showing, the last slide was talking about projects. This one's talking about megawatts. So based on the size of the project, what are the megawatts that category is contributing to the overall megawatts that are approved in a given year? And I mean, it's not surprising that the projects that are larger than 150 are contributing the most amount of megawatts. But I do think it's interesting to see what a large percentage of projects that are being processed are those projects less than 5 megawatts, but what a small percentage of the megawatts all those projects add up to. And so I kind of asked, well, are projects that are smaller more likely to get approved? Or are they more likely to get denied? And we looked at this last quarter, and it's the same results this quarter. There really isn't a huge variation in whether a project is approved or denied or withdrawn based on its size, other than to say it's projects that are really large. These projects over 150 surprisingly just have the highest rate of approval. And that was surprising to me last quarter, and it remains surprising to me now. So I think that's interesting. It leads to more questions about, well, are there any correlations? Like, is there any affiliation or relationship between all these different variables, the project size, the location, the region, the time it takes to get it approved, the outcome of the application? And so Emily, our data scientist, ran a number of correlation test analysis to determine whether there was any significant relationship between these variables, and did not find any, surprisingly. Well, other than acreage correlating with megawattage, which, that's pretty obvious, but didn't find anything. So she did some scatter plots and some ANOVA tests and chi-square tests, and this box chart here shows the box is the middle 50% of, this is 5 to 20 megawatts, 20 to 150. I don't know why 150 is, I'm sorry, less than 5 is in this position, but it is. And here's 150 and above. There's just no strong correlation or any indication that, the size of the project or any of the characteristics have result in a higher likelihood for approval. It really seems to show that these project approvals and denials and the amount of time these projects take to get approved, it's case dependent. It's a case by case outcome. And that sort of echoes a little bit about how we talk about local permitting within the context of all the other permitting processes that come into play here. So local permitting, we could say there's 14,400 megawatts approved, but we have to then consider, well, how many of those are moving forward to getting state permitting, and how many of those are getting through PJM, and ultimately what is operational, right? How many of those megawatts are getting on the grid? And I think this is really telling. We've done, so far a great job of getting projects through local permitting, through state permitting even. There's clearly some kind of barrier when it comes to getting projects through PJM into operation. And it brings up, this question of, well, is the solution, if we're thinking about it, like, is there an option to improve these barriers that happen through this process? And if not, then we're going to have to really think about how to improve the volume of projects that are attempting to get through this process. So local permitting would then have to, really be ramped up to get the project megawattages that ultimately become operational onto the grid. We ran a little analysis just for fun to look at, given the information that we had about project timelines, where the most time was being spent in this long process. And so what we have here, there's upper and lower fences. The median, the middle 50% of project timeline, and then, sorry, the middle 50%, and then the median is the line within the box. And so the smaller the box, the smaller the middle 50% is, which means it's like a more predictable process, or it's a more predictable timeline for the process. And so this first, I guess this font might be kind of small for you to see. This first box on the left says local application to local approval. And so the median on that is 145 days, and the middle 50% is 83 to 326 days, so around 4.5 months. When we look at local approval to state approval, that is the period of time in which I believe you all are getting your applications ready, you're doing your studies, you're getting everything either to go to the DEQ or the SCC. I will mention we did run SCC and DEQ separately, and there was really no really no measurable difference. And so we decided for the purpose of this visual, we just combine the two. So we put local approval to state application as one, and that the median was 277 days. And then the middle 50% was 91 to 488 days. So 16 months is the upper limit of the middle 50%. We thought that was a lot. Interesting. It kind of can explain why we're seeing a lot of the megawattage approved at local not yet getting into the queue for the state approval process. So not a pending megawattage and not yet having been approved. But it also echoes some research that we did here at UVA back in 2020, I believe, 2021, where we looked at some of the largest projects across the state and looked at their timelines and identified this process between local and state as being one of the longest portions of the approvals process. The next is the state application to state approval analysis, and this is this is where we combine the SEC and the DEQ, and so you can see there's a really tight 50%, the median smack dab in the middle. There's not a really big range between the upper and the lower fences. And so this indicates it's a pretty predictable timeline process. It's not a lot of variation happening there. And then the final analysis we did here was looking at the timeline between state approval and commercial operation. Obviously, this is like construction and interconnection, and so you do expect to see a lot of variation and a longer timeline for that. So the median on this one was 664 days, and the middle 50% was 443 to 1,090 days. So gives you a little bit more insight into the total pipeline of like not just projects you've worked on, but projects that almost, all the projects that got approved at the local level and have moved forward of like how they measure up. And then the final little piece of data I'd like to share with you, because you are the energy storage association representing energy storage, is we do have some data on solar plus storage projects in our database. And so we just pulled those out and took a look at them. I wanted to see how many applications each year had solar plus storage. And we've got 24 projects total. This is the distribution. So we've had the total, the highest was 6 in 2020, but so far in 2025, we had 3 and we're halfway through the year. So we'll have to see if that becomes a trend. We'll have to see if those numbers increase. But of the 24 that were proposed, 9 were approved, and that represents around 328 megawatts. So some of our observations about emerging opportunities, we ran into a lot of problems with defining agrivoltaics and brownfields at the local level. We have definitions for brownfields that DEQ uses or that the state uses for state level applications, but that definition doesn't always translate down to the local level when they're evaluating a project. So that it's not always logged or reported consistently whether a project is a brownfield or not in the local review. And then finally, agrivoltaics, there isn't like a standard way to define this or to require it. So we're seeing a lot of projects say, well, this project, could have sheep grazing, or we're proposing to do sheep grazing, but then there's no mechanism in the approval that would require it or require it, for more than at the time that the project, gets its operational permit. So that enforcement piece. So we're not comfortable at this point providing data on whether localities are approving projects that are brownfields or agrivoltaics, but we can show when the state has designated it as a brownfield site. So I think that's an opportunity to think about. Of course, we want to explore a little bit more about why projects are dropping out or what the long delays after local approval mean for the ability for megawatts to get on the grid. So understanding what that full timeline looks like and how does that relate to local permitting and how much local permitting we need. There's, again, no clear evidence of correlation in any of these things. So That's something else to really think about and explore. I mean, should there be, like, should smaller projects or larger projects or projects with certain attributes, should there be a correlation between their approval rates or the time it takes to get them approved? We are hearing a lot of increased activity for energy storage, so zoning ordinances, being updated to address energy storage. And so we think now is the time to consider adding energy storage, standalone energy storage, battery energy storage to our database. We'd love to get ahead of it before it gets, to be a mad rush. And so to do that, we need support, we need financial support, but we're really looking for stakeholders who are willing to work with us to help us go through the process of prioritizing data points, making definitions, much like we did for the solar part of the database. And then finally, we're just not clear on how these PJM, the pause in the queue, and how other factors such as recent federal policies are going to be affecting local application rates and timelines in the pipeline for these projects. I think, like Robin said, I guess it's probably more important now than ever to have really reliable data to help tell the story and help monitor what's happening, so that to the extent that state policy or local policy can address some of these things, we have good data upon which to evaluate those options. So what's next for us? So we really want to continue to offer this, really powerful public resource, and we want to ensure that it keeps pace with this rapidly changing energy landscape, including integrating battery storage and potentially other technologies. To do this, we're looking to raise $300,000 to support this work for the next 3 years. We want to continue to offer it as free, unbiased, a trusted public resource. We want to continue to offer quarterly updates of the project data, as well as offer presentations, quarterly reports, infographics. We want to expand the data points that are published. So we have 35, we have another 25 in the works. We'd like to look at which of those we could expand and add to the database. We'd like to improve our geospatial mapping and compatibility of that with external sources so that it becomes easier to use some of the potentially DEQ or state level mapping with the information that we have through local permitting. We would like to make our web scraping report available to others to take advantage of it. So we've particularly identified this as a benefit that would probably be attractive to donors. And we want to expand to include battery storage as well. So for donors that can support us, we're hoping that they'd be amenable to public disclosure of their support. It's really important that our work remains transparent to retain the public trust and to remain unbiased. We will offer to post company logos on our database website and publications that we issue. We will provide donors advanced access to our quarterly data updates, as well as a copy of the solar report, which is our web scraping results. And yes, if we expand to include energy storage, we'll probably have to rename that report from our solar report to something else. And then we can give donors access to some of our additional data points that are unpublished to the public. If you're interested in supporting this, the Weldon Cooper Center has a Give Campus page, which functions like a GoFundMe. So it's like crowdsourcing support to support the project. And if you're in a position to do that, I would greatly appreciate it and thank you. If you go to this site, there's a QR code here. You can go to this Give Campus website. You want to select under the designation category, the Energy Transition Initiative. Or if you're in a position to offer like a major donation, which I think is usually defined as over 25,000, you can work with us, UVA's corporate and foundation relations on those larger donations. And I'm happy to put you in touch with them. Ryan, I think, is on the call today, and he'd be happy to meet with anybody who wants to have discussions about what that might be, what opportunities there are there. And so with that, I'll thank you, and I'll turn it over to Robin and then come back for some Q&A. Robin, you're on mute.
Of course I am. Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a great presentation, and I think there were things there that one I probably should have already known. But I'm going to be looking back on this slide deck to know better, and probably I'll have my own follow-up questions for you. Kind of piggybacking off of you're talking about energy storage, and and for everyone who's looked at the federal HR1 knows that the 30% ITC still exists and will continue to exist for multiple years for energy storage. So I think this is an area ripe for growth, and certainly the need for not just the tracking data, but I think also, for the same kind of reports for storage around soft costs, around deployment best practices, zoning, ordinances, everything that we can do to make sure that to smooth the deployment of storage, whether standalone or paired with solar, I think is going to be greatly important. I wanted to touch on briefly just kind of what we can see as the broader role of storage, and then touch on two pieces of legislation, one that passed, one that didn't, but I think is likely to come back in this coming session, in order to kind of buttress the whole point of we should be seeing a lot more storage based on what's coming in law. Firstly, I think of energy storage as one of the big enablers for solar. As we see greater data center load, as we look at ground mount opportunities, as we look at on-site storage opportunities, there's such a big opportunity if we can get the economics right. And that's what allows for the grid balancing. That's what can really unlock solar's ability to be a resource adequacy solution. I know, Elizabeth, you've still got the slides. Can we go to the next one? Thank you. First, I want to talk about HB 2346 and SB 1100. This was legislation that passed to create a virtual power plant program. So, this I think we're going to see as predominantly an on-site solar opportunity, but depending on what the SEC does, I could see community solar paired with storage being also potentially included here. The legislation was very light on details, but what it does authorize is the SEC to authorize as much as 450 megawatts in Dominion territory in this program, but only authorizes automatically 15 megawatts of residential virtual power plant capacity. So, this law, one of the versions of the bill at this point, at one point, kind of just automatically assumed that it would all be utility owned assets. We were able to get that out, but we now have like a clean version of this bill that did become law. So there's going to be a lot of work on the implementation side, but when we talk about storage and its role, virtual power plants, grid services, and the resource adequacy that it can enable, this is one of those programs that very much can do that. Next slide. This is a bill, HB 2537, SB 1394, that the legislature passed, General Assembly passed, but the governor refused to sign it in the form in which it did, and had what I would call a poison pill amendment in it that was rejected by the General Assembly and then finally vetoed by the governor. This would have, in the big picture, introduced the definition of long duration energy storage, who's anything over 10 hours of discharge, and created pilot programs and deployment targets, as well as increase the current in-law storage targets, but honing those to be focused on short duration energy storage. What's, I think, also very important that this bill would have done is required storage regulations to be revised at least every 5 years. They were last implemented in around 2021, 2022. And so what we haven't seen from the SEC is a lot of use of the discretion and authority granted to them in the Virginia Clean Economy Act. That's meant that we haven't seen a lot of storage regulations or programs that are an outgrowth of this. So, as the clock is definitely now ticking on an energy storage investment tax credit, we CHESSA as a CHESSA side, we certainly see a big opportunity in making sure that state policy is going to enable storage as much as possible. And we want to make sure that we can see things like, programs like deployment incentives, because you can't, virtual power plant programs cannot leverage assets that do not exist. So we've got to deploy these programs, and there's all the public benefits that come with it. And then, we see grid services programs that can best enable those assets once they are built. So kind of that two-part, policy phase. So these are the kinds of programs that we can and will have, and I think also determine a whole lot of potential. And if programs like these, if legislation like this one were to go online and get passed, say next year, it only increases the need for the Cooper Center to be able to track and do all of the work that they've already been doing for solar, and be forced to rename all of those solar reports into something more. So just wanting to step into kind of the advocacy role and viewpoint there for a second. And I'll turn it back to Elizabeth and Jenny to manage the Q&A from here.
Thanks, Robin. So we've had a couple questions come in, and I know we're getting close to the end of our time. So Elizabeth, the first question that came in is it possible to put the donation link in the chat? And if not, if you want to send it to me, I'm happy to send it out to everybody as well, and to share it with the CvilleREA team.
Yeah, I'd love to. I have to go get it. So I might stop screen sharing here and go grab it, and I'll put it in the link for us.
Sounds good. While you're doing that, the next question that came in was, are you getting many inbound consultation requests from jurisdictions, and especially from South and Southwest side counties?
Yeah, we haven't in recent months. It has slowed down. I think a lot of the questions that come in are very targeted and very specific to things related to like tax revenue, siting agreement things that are, I guess, a little more strategic in terms of how to evaluate capturing the benefits of solar projects, a little more so than the earlier days where we were getting a lot more questions about things like zoning ordinances and things of that nature.
The next question that came in is, what happens to this valuable data if you receive limited to no additional funding?
Yeah, I mean, it'll stay live as of the date that it was last updated. And I think that would be it.
What are ways companies can get involved with the work that you do if currently financial is not a route they can currently take?
Well, that's a great question. So we are always looking for stakeholders who are willing to offer their experience and work with us on both the database project, but also other projects that we have going on. So we're gearing up to do a financial analysis of siting agreements project, and we've got some other things in the works. So if someone's interested in participating, I would say please reach out to me and let me know, and we can talk together about your experience and what you're willing or able to offer, and we'd love to start a conversation.
Great. And this, I think, is going to be our last question. The person would like to know, when will the next data release be?
So the data I presented to you all today is the data that we will be releasing this week. As of now, we're scheduled to do the release tomorrow. So as long as there's no technological issues with updating the live website from the development site, which is where everything is now, that should be live tomorrow.
Perfect. And then they had a follow-up. And what about the one after that? When will the release after that be?
So we work quarterly. It's a quarter by quarter basis because of funding right now. So I'm hoping that we will get to a point where we are green lighted to continue with the next quarter. And if that happens, then I suspect we would probably work towards closing the data collection. I don't know. Let's see, July, August, September, middle of September, I guess.
Perfect, thanks. And actually, one more question slipped in, so we'll end on this one. Have you done any analysis on the value of siting agreements? This person has seen a large variation in amounts. Also, any differences between those for projects that can be put on the ratepayer through an SEC case and projects from independent power producers?
So that is a great question, and that is what we are working on right now. I have a really, really talented student, a professor that we're speaking with from the comm school, Bill Shobe, who is an economist here at the Cooper Center, working to define this research question around siting agreements and how to structure and look at the different ways that those financial benefits can, be determined and allocated and retrieved. So those are the kinds of questions that we're going to be asking ourselves as we're designing the project, which I don't know who wrote the question. I'll have to find out, but I could get in touch with them and I'd love to have a conversation about it because it sounds like they have plenty of insights and opinions about what would be beneficial for us to look into.
I'll let you know who it is.
Okay. And I'm still trying to, I'm been talking, so I haven't pulled that link, but I'm getting ready to pull it right here and I'll stick it in the chat.
Well, while you do that, I'll take the mic real quick as one, just to reiterate my thank you to everyone who attended, to you, Elizabeth, for presenting, for Jenny, for leading the organizing for all of this. And I'll just put in a plug for folks. As you see in Jenny's avatar, CHESSA's Solar Focus Conference is once again this November. We're going to be in Arlington. We're stone's throw from DCA at the Renaissance Arlington Capitol View Hotel. Tickets are live, sponsor opportunities are live, and if you want to be in person to get presentations and panels and sessions, similar value, high value is what you've just heard, please sign up, please come to the conference, join us there, join the broader solar storage stakeholder community. We're going to be talking a lot about the ripple effects from HR1, what does the future bring. We'll be announcing keynotes very soon as well. It's going to be jam-packed as it is every year, but get your tickets. Go to chessa.org and click on the Solar Focus tab, and you'll see all the information.
Well, Robin, you wrapped it up for us. So thanks everybody again for joining us today. Elizabeth, thank you. CvilleREA, it was a pleasure to co-host with you all, and we'll see you next time. Thanks everybody. Have a good one. Stay cool.